The autumn wind of 1892 swept across the Wyoming grasslands with the bite of winter still weeks away, carrying with it the scent of dried buffalo grass and the promise of an early storm. Eleanor Hayes pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she worked to repair the sagging door of the horse stable, her calloused hands gripping the hammer with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to be her own carpenter, blacksmith, and ranch hand all at once. The sky above had turned the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that rolled in from the mountains like a slow-moving army. Eleanor paused in her work to study the horizon, calculating how much daylight remained. At 28, she had developed the weathered instincts of someone who had spent the better part of 5 years reading the moods of this harsh and beautiful land. Her late husband's ranch, now hers by law but still feeling borrowed in her heart, stretched out before her in golden waves that bent and swayed with each gust of wind. She had just raised the hammer again when movement at the gate caught her eye. A small figure was running toward the house, stumbling slightly over the uneven ground. Eleanor set down her tools and shaded her eyes with one hand, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a child, a little girl, by the look of her dress, running with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing from trouble or racing against time. The child's bonnet had come loose and trailed behind her like a pale flag, her copper-colored braids bouncing with each hurried step. As she drew closer, Eleanor could see the bright flush of exertion on her cheeks and the way her small chest rose and fell with labored breathing. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in a faded blue dress that had been mended more than once and a woolen coat that looked too large for her small frame. Eleanor walked toward the gate, her brow furrowed with concern. Children didn't often venture this far from town, especially not alone, and certainly not with the kind of urgency this little one displayed. The nearest neighbor was the Wilson place, 3 miles to the east, and beyond that lay only the open range where the cattle drivers made their camps. "Child, what's wrong?" Eleanor called out as the girl reached the wooden fence that surrounded the house and its outbuildings. "Are you hurt?" The little girl stopped at the gate, one small hand gripping the top rail as she tried to catch her breath. Her eyes were the color of summer sky, wide and earnest, and they fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that seemed far too serious for such a young face. For a moment, she simply stood there, chest heaving, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Ma'am?" the child finally said, her voice carrying the soft drawl of someone raised among the ranching folk. "I come with a message." Eleanor stepped closer, noting the way the girl's fingers trembled slightly on the gate rail. It wasn't just from the cold. There was something else, a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate through her small frame like a tightly wound spring. "A message? From whom, dear?" The girl took a deep breath, her chin lifting with sudden determination. "From my papa. He's afraid to tell you himself, but—" She paused, her cheeks growing even redder, though whether from embarrassment or the wind, Eleanor couldn't tell. "But Papa loves you, ma'am. He surely does." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily speechless. She stared at the child, certain she had misheard, but the girl's earnest expression told her otherwise. The wind chose that moment to gust harder, sending Eleanor's dark hair whipping around her face and rattling the loose boards of the stable door she'd been trying to repair. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor managed to say, her voice barely audible over the wind. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she had been entrusted with a mission of the utmost importance. "Papa says you're the finest woman in all of Wyoming. Ma'am, he says it every night when we sit by the fire, and when he thinks I'm sleeping, he talks about how brave you are, living out here all by yourself and making this place work." She gestured toward the ranch with one small hand. "He says you got more grit than most men he knows." Eleanor felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, followed immediately by a wave of confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. She had grown so accustomed to her solitary life that the idea of someone, a man no less, thinking about her, talking about her, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "Child, what's your name?" Eleanor asked, kneeling down so she could look the girl in the eye. "Lily Reed, ma'am. My papa is Thomas Reed. He works the cattle drive that camps over in Willow Creek Valley." Lily's eyes brightened slightly as she spoke of her father. "He's the finest cowboy in all the territory, ma'am. All the other men say so." Thomas Reed. Eleanor turned the name over in her mind, but it meant nothing to her. She tried to recall if she had ever encountered a man by that name in town or at the general store, but came up empty. Yet this Thomas Reed knew of her, had been watching her from afar, had spoken of her to his daughter with what sounded remarkably like admiration. "Lily," Eleanor said gently, "where is your papa now? Does he know you've come here?" The girl's expression faltered slightly. "He's with the herd. Ma'am, they're getting ready to move the cattle to winter pasture before the snows come." She bit her lower lip, a gesture that made her look even younger. "He doesn't know I come. I heard him talking to Mr. Johnson, that's the trail boss, about how he wanted to call on you proper-like. But he was afraid you'd think poorly of him on account of him being just a cowhand and you being a lady with your own spread." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the girl's words. The idea that this unknown man, this Thomas Reed, thought her too fine for his attention was both touching and absurd. If he could see her now, with her work-worn hands and her hair escaping its pins, wearing a dress that had seen better days and boots that had been resoled twice, he might think differently. "So you decided to deliver his message yourself?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep a small smile from tugging at the corners of her mouth. Lily nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. Papa's been sad-like lately, staring off at nothing and sighing when he thinks I ain't paying attention. I figured if he was too scared to tell you how he feels, then maybe I could help him along." She straightened her shoulders with the confidence of the very young. "Mama always said that sometimes the women folk have to take matters into their own hands." The mention of the girl's mother sent a pang through Eleanor. "Your mama? Is she—" "She passed when I was little, ma'am. It's just been Papa and me for as long as I can remember." Lily's voice remained steady, but Eleanor caught the brief shadow that crossed her face. "Papa takes real good care of me, though he taught me to ride and rope and everything." The wind gusted again, this time carrying with it the first few drops of what promised to be a substantial downpour. Eleanor glanced up at the darkening sky, then back at the child who stood before her, still gripping the gate with white-knuckled determination. "Lily, you need to get inside before the storm hits properly," Eleanor said, reaching over to unlatch the gate. "Come on, we'll get you warmed up and figure out how to get word to your papa that you're safe." As the little girl stepped through the gate, Eleanor felt the first real stirring of curiosity she had experienced in months. Thomas Reed, a man she had never met, who knew her only from a distance, who spoke of her with such regard that his 7-year-old daughter had felt compelled to run through the gathering dusk to deliver his unspoken feelings. The thought should have alarmed her, perhaps even angered her. Instead, as she guided Lily toward the warm glow of the house, Eleanor found herself wondering what kind of man could inspire such loyalty in his child, and what he might have seen in her that made him think her worthy of his quiet admiration. The storm was coming, but for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, Eleanor Hayes felt something other than resignation as she faced the approaching darkness. The kitchen of Eleanor's house had always been her sanctuary, the one room where the weight of managing the ranch alone seemed to lift from her shoulders. As she guided young Lily through the door, the familiar warmth of the cast-iron stove and the soft glow of kerosene lamps created an island of comfort against the growing storm outside. Rain had begun to patter steadily against the windows, and the wind rattled the shutters with increasing intensity. "Sit yourself down by the fire, child," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the wooden chair she had pulled close to the stove. "Let me get you something warm to drink." Lily perched on the edge of the chair, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, though her eyes darted around the room with obvious curiosity. Eleanor noticed how the girl's worn coat hung loose on her thin frame, how her boots had been carefully patched, and how she carried herself with the particular carefulness of a child who had learned not to be a burden. "This is a real nice place, ma'am," Lily said quietly, watching as Eleanor moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency. "Papa always says your house looks like it has good bones, whatever that means." Eleanor paused in her preparation of tea, a small smile playing at her lips. "It means the house was built to last, built by someone who cared about doing things right." She set the kettle on the stove and turned to study her unexpected guest. "How often does your papa notice my house?" Lily's face brightened, and for the first time since arriving, she seemed to relax. "Oh, all the time, ma'am. When we ride past on the way to move the herds, he always slows down his horse and looks real careful-like. He points out how you keep the fences mended and the barn painted, and how your vegetable garden is the neatest one he's ever seen." She swung her legs slightly, the heels of her boots tapping against the chair. "Sometimes, when the weather's clear, we can see you working from way off, and Papa gets this look on his face like he's watching something precious." The kettle began to whistle, and Eleanor was grateful for the excuse to turn away, to hide the flush she felt creeping up her neck. She had grown so accustomed to her isolation that the idea of being observed, of being noticed and appreciated from afar, felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Tell me about your papa," Eleanor said as she poured hot water over tea leaves in her best china cup, a wedding gift that rarely saw use anymore. "What's he like when he's not, when he's not watching my house from a distance?" Lily's face lit up with the uncomplicated love of a child for her parent. "Papa's the kindest man you ever did see, ma'am. He never raises his voice, not even when I do something foolish like wander off or forget to hobble my pony. And he's strong, stronger than any of the other cowboys. Last spring, when Mr. Henderson's bull got loose and was charging toward the chuck wagon, Papa roped that beast all by himself." Eleanor set the steaming cup before Lily, noting how the girl's eyes widened with delight at the delicate floral pattern on the china. "He sounds very capable." "Oh, he is, ma'am. But he's gentle, too. Every night, no matter how tired he is from riding all day, he braids my hair and tells me stories. Sometimes they're about the places he's been. He's traveled all over this territory, from Colorado to Montana. But mostly he tells me about Mama, about how they met and how happy they were." Lily took a careful sip of tea, her small fingers wrapped around the cup for warmth. "He says I look just like her, except for my eyes. I got his eyes." "And what does he tell you about me?" Eleanor asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. But Lily didn't seem to find it strange. "Lots of things. He says you're the bravest woman he's ever seen, living out here all alone after your husband passed. He says most folks would have given up and moved back east, but you stayed and made this place work." Lily leaned forward conspiratorially. "He told me once that watching you work your land gives him hope that good things can grow in hard ground." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For so long, she had viewed her determination to keep the ranch as simple stubbornness, a refusal to admit defeat. The idea that someone saw it as courage, as something admirable, was like discovering a gift she hadn't known she possessed. "He talks about you when he thinks I'm sleeping too," Lily continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a great secret. "Sometimes, when we're camped under the stars and the fires burn down low, I hear him talking to Mama's picture. He tells her about seeing you hanging laundry on the line, or fixing fence posts, or leading that big gray horse of yours to pasture. He says he wishes he was brave enough to introduce himself proper-like, but he's afraid you'd think he was just another drifter." "Why would he think that?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Lily's expression grew serious beyond her years. "Because he doesn't have much, ma'am, just his horse and his gear and whatever wages he earns moving cattle. He says a lady like you, with your own land and your own house, wouldn't want anything to do with a man who lives out of a bedroll." She took another sip of tea, then added quietly, but I think he's wrong. I think you're lonely too, just like he is." The simple honesty of the statement hit Eleanor harder than any elaborate declaration might have. She had grown so skilled at convincing herself that she preferred solitude, that she was better off without the complications of human attachment, that hearing her loneliness acknowledged so matter-of-factly by a child was like having a wound she'd forgotten she carried suddenly exposed to air. Outside, the storm was gaining strength. Lightning flickered through the kitchen windows, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Eleanor glanced toward the door, then back at Lily, who was watching her with those earnest blue eyes. "How far is it to your camp?" Eleanor asked. "About 5 miles, ma'am, over by Willow Creek. But Papa and the other men were planning to move the herd tomorrow if the weather cleared." Lily bit her lower lip again. I might have left without telling anyone where I was going." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Might have?" "Well, I told Mrs. Peterson, she's the cook's wife, that I was going to look for prairie flowers before the frost killed them. I just didn't mention how far I planned to look." Lily's cheeks reddened. "Papa's going to be mighty worried when he finds out I'm gone." "I imagine he will be." Eleanor moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and she could barely make out the outline of the barn through the downpour. "You'll have to stay here tonight, child. No one could travel in this weather, and I won't have you catching your death trying to get back to camp." Relief flickered across Lily's face, though she tried to hide it. "I don't want to be a bother, ma'am." "You're not a bother." Eleanor surprised herself with how much she meant it. The house had been quiet for so long that the sound of another voice, even a young one, felt like music. "Tomorrow, when the storm passes, we'll figure out how to get word to your papa that you're safe." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain drumming against the roof and the occasional crack of thunder. Eleanor found herself studying the girl, the way she held her cup so carefully, the way she sat straight-backed despite her obvious fatigue, the way her eyes kept drifting to the photographs on the mantelpiece. "That's your husband, isn't it?" Lily asked, following Eleanor's gaze to the daguerreotype of a serious-looking man in a dark suit. "Yes, James Hayes. He died 3 winters ago." Eleanor's voice remained steady, though speaking of James still brought a familiar ache. "Pneumonia took him. He was a good man. Papa says losing someone you love is like having a piece of your heart cut away, but that the love itself never dies." Lily's words carried the weight of her own loss. "Do you think that's true?" Eleanor considered the question, surprised by its depth. "I think your papa is a wise man." "He'd like you to know that," Lily said with a small smile. "He'd like you to know a lot of things. Actually, like how he admires the way you've kept your husband's memory alive by taking care of the land he loved, and how he thinks you have the prettiest smile in the whole territory, even though he's only seen it a few times when you've been in town." "He's noticed my smile?" Eleanor felt heat creep up her cheeks again. "Oh yes, ma'am. He says it's like sunshine breaking through storm clouds." Lily yawned suddenly, the long day and warm tea finally catching up with her. "He says lots of poetic things like that. I think he might have been a scholar or something before he became a cowboy." Eleanor filed that information away, adding it to the growing picture of Thomas Reed that was forming in her mind. A man who spoke poetry to his daughter, who honored the memory of his late wife, who saw courage where others might see mere stubbornness. A man who had been watching her from afar with what sounded remarkably like reverence. As the storm raged outside and the little girl began to nod sleepily in her chair, Eleanor found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would Thomas Reed come looking for his daughter? Would she finally meet the man who had been occupying the thoughts she hadn't realized she'd been having? For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Hayes fell asleep to the sound of another person breathing in her house and found that the loneliness she had grown so accustomed to felt suddenly, impossibly, like something that might be cured. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a pale October sun. Eleanor woke before dawn, as was her habit, but found herself moving more quietly than usual through her morning routine. Young Lily still slept soundly in the spare bedroom, curled beneath Eleanor's best quilt like a small bird in a nest. Eleanor had just finished feeding the chickens and was drawing water from the well when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east. Her heart began to beat faster, though she told herself it could be anyone, a neighbor, a traveling merchant, even the circuit preacher making his monthly rounds. But something in the steady, purposeful rhythm of the horse's gait told her otherwise. She straightened, smoothing her skirts and checking that her hair was properly pinned, though she couldn't quite explain why it suddenly seemed important. Through the morning mist that still clung to the valley floor, she could see a lone rider approaching at a measured pace, even at a distance. There was something about the way he sat his horse, straight-backed but easy, as if he and the animal were old partners in the business of covering ground, that spoke of a man comfortable in the saddle. As the rider drew closer, Eleanor could make out more details. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a well-worn hat and a coat that had seen many seasons. His horse was a sturdy bay, the kind of reliable mount a working cowboy would choose over a flashier animal. The man's face remained shadowed beneath his hat brim, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes swept the ranch buildings as if searching for signs of life. Eleanor walked toward the gate, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, trying to appear calmer than she felt. This had to be Thomas Reed, Lily's papa, the man who had been watching her from afar, who spoke of her to his daughter with what the child claimed was admiration and longing. The man whose unspoken feelings had driven a 7-year-old girl to run 5 miles through threatening weather. The rider slowed his horse as he approached the gate, and Eleanor caught her first clear glimpse of his face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that showed beneath his hat and strong, weathered features that spoke of years spent under the prairie sun. His eyes, when they met hers, were the same clear blue as his daughter's, but shadowed with worry and something that might have been embarrassment. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the wooden rails of the gate. Eleanor found herself noting the way he held himself, confident but not arrogant, alert but not aggressive. There was a steadiness about him that reminded her of the reliable horses he clearly favored, a sense that here was a man who could be counted on when trouble came calling. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both respectful and slightly formal. His voice was deeper than she had expected, with the slow cadence of a man who thought before he spoke. "I'm Thomas Reed. I believe you might have my daughter." "Mr. Reed." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Lily is safe. She's still sleeping. The poor child was exhausted when she arrived last night." She saw the tension leave his shoulders at her words, though his eyes remained troubled. "I'm mighty grateful to you for taking her in, ma'am, when we discovered she was missing." He trailed off, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Well, I've never been so scared in all my born days." Eleanor found herself studying the way the morning light caught the silver threads at his temples, the way his hands, large and capable-looking, handled his hat with unconscious care. She's a brave girl, Mr. Reed, and a loyal one, though I suspect you know that already. Something flickered in his eyes, part pride, part concern, and something else that might have been shame. "Yes, ma'am, she is sometimes too loyal for her own good." He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before meeting hers again. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. Lily, she has a tendency to speak out of turn, to say things that, well, things that maybe shouldn't be said." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. She seemed quite certain of her message. "Mr. Reed." The color that crept up his neck and into his face was almost endearing. Here was this strong, capable man, a man who could rope a charging bull and live his life under the open sky, rendered speechless by the mention of his own feelings. He shifted in his saddle, his horse sensing his discomfort and stepping sideways restlessly. "Ma'am, she had no right to—" He stopped, took a breath, and seemed to gather himself. "Mrs. Hayes, I hope you'll forgive a foolish child's words. I never meant for you to be troubled with such nonsense." Nonsense. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised by the small flare of disappointment she felt. "Is that what you call it?" Thomas Reed's eyes snapped back to hers, and she saw something flicker there: surprise, hope, and a careful wariness. No, ma'am, that's not what I'd call it." His voice had grown quieter, more thoughtful. "But I figured you might—" The honesty in his words, the simple directness of them, touched something in Eleanor that had been sleeping for too long. This was not a man given to pretty speeches or elaborate courtship rituals. This was a man who spoke truth, even when it cost him. "Mr. Reed," she said carefully, "would you like to come in for coffee? Lily will want to see you when she wakes, and I imagine you could use something warm after your ride." For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse to the hitching post near the gate. "That's very kind of you, ma'am. Very kind indeed." As he secured his mount, Eleanor found herself watching the easy efficiency of his movements, the way he checked his horse's bridle and gave the animal an affectionate pat on the neck. There was something revealing about the way a man treated his horse. Her late husband had always said, and what she saw in Thomas Reed's gentle attention to his mount spoke well of his character. He followed her toward the house, and she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the soft jingle of his spurs, the measured tread of his boots on the wooden porch steps. When she glanced back, she found him looking around the property with what appeared to be genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. "You keep a fine place here, Mrs. Hayes," he said as she led him into the kitchen. "Your late husband would be proud." The comment caught her off guard. Not just the sentiment, but the fact that he knew about James, that he had taken the trouble to learn something of her circumstances. "Thank you. That means a great deal." She busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her hands. The kitchen, which had felt so comfortable with Lily's presence the night before, now seemed charged with a different kind of energy. Thomas Reed filled the space in a way that was both unsettling and oddly pleasant, his broad shoulders and tall frame making the room feel smaller, more intimate. "Lily told me quite a bit about you last night," Eleanor said, measuring coffee into the pot with careful precision. "She thinks very highly of her papa." "She's all I've got left of her mother," Thomas said quietly. "Sometimes I worry I'm not doing right by her, raising her the way I do. A little girl she needs things I don't know how to give her." Eleanor turned to study him, noting the genuine concern in his voice. "She seems happy, well cared for, loved." "I do love her," he said simply. "More than my own life. But love isn't always enough, is it? She needs schooling, proper clothes, the company of other women who can teach her things a man can't." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor suspect this conversation touched on deeper worries than just his daughter's upbringing. "Is that why you've been watching my place? Looking for someone who might provide those things?" Thomas Reed's face went red again, but this time he didn't look away. "No, ma'am, that's not why—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself, then continued with the air of a man jumping off a cliff. "I've been watching because I couldn't seem to help myself, because every time I ride past and see you working your land, taking care of what's yours, I think that's the kind of woman a man would be lucky to share his life with." The simple honesty of it took Eleanor's breath away. No pretty words or elaborate compliments, just truth spoken plainly by a man who clearly wasn't comfortable with such revelations. Before she could respond, the sound of small feet on the stairs announced Lily's awakening. The girl appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, her hair tousled and her dress wrinkled from sleep. When she saw her father, her face lit up with pure joy. "Papa!" She launched herself into his arms, and Eleanor watched as Thomas Reed's face transformed, all the awkwardness and uncertainty melting away as he gathered his daughter close. "There's my girl," he murmured into her hair. "You had me worried sick, little one." "I'm sorry, Papa, but I had to come. I had to tell Mrs. Hayes about how you feel, because you were too scared to do it yourself." Lily pulled back to look at her father's face, her small hands framing his cheeks. "Did you tell her? Did you finally tell her?" Thomas Reed's eyes met Eleanor's over his daughter's head, and in them she saw a mixture of love, hope, and the kind of quiet courage that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but showed itself in steady action, day after day. "I'm working on it, sweetheart," he said softly. "I'm working on it." As Eleanor poured coffee for the three of them and watched this man interact with his daughter, patient, gentle, completely devoted, she found herself thinking that perhaps Lily Reed was wiser than any of them had given her credit for. Perhaps some things were too important to leave to the slow courtship of cautious adults. Perhaps sometimes it took the bold heart of a child to push the world in the direction it needed to go. Thomas Reed left that morning with promises to return Lily safely to camp, but not before pressing a small cloth bag into Eleanor's hands. "Flour," he said simply, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "and some honey from the wild bees we found up in the canyon. For your trouble." When she started to protest that no payment was necessary, he touched his hat brim and said quietly, "A man pays his debts, ma'am, one way or another." Eleanor had expected that to be the end of it. A brief encounter with a decent man and his charming daughter. A small break in the routine of her solitary life. She told herself she was satisfied with having met the mysterious Thomas Reed, with putting a face to the name that had occupied her thoughts since Lily's unexpected visit. But 3 days later, when she went to check on the horses in the morning, she found that the sagging stable door she had been struggling to repair was hanging straight and true on its hinges. The wood was still damp with morning dew, but the work was clearly fresh. New leather hinges had been carefully fitted, and the door frame itself had been reinforced with additional bracing. Eleanor stood staring at the repair for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. No one had been on her property the night before. She was certain of that, which meant someone had come in the dark hours before dawn, working by feel and memory to fix what she had been unable to manage on her own. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, noting the precision of the work, the way the new leather had been oiled to match the color of the existing hardware. This was not the hasty patch job of someone trying to do a quick favor. This was careful, thoughtful craftsmanship, the work of a man who took pride in doing things right. 2 days after that, she discovered that the section of fence behind the chicken coop, which had been leaning at a precarious angle since the spring storms, was standing straight and secure. New posts had been sunk, the wire stretched tight, and the gate that had never quite latched properly now closed with a satisfying click. Eleanor found herself walking the perimeter of her property each morning, not quite admitting to herself that she was looking for signs of Thomas Reed's nocturnal visits. She began to leave the kitchen lamp burning a little longer in the evenings, telling herself it was for safety, but knowing in her heart that she hoped he might see the light and know he was welcome. A week later, Lily appeared at her gate again, this time in broad daylight and with her father's knowledge. "Papa said I could come visit if you don't mind the company." "Ma'am," the little girl announced, her face bright with anticipation. "He's helping Mr. Johnson move the herd to the winter pasture, but they're camped close enough that I can ride over." Eleanor found that she didn't mind the company at all. In fact, she discovered that she had been looking forward to it more than she cared to admit. Lily was an easy child to be around, helpful without being asked, cheerful without being demanding, and full of stories about life on the trail that filled Eleanor's quiet house with laughter. "Papa taught me to make biscuits on the chuck wagon," Lily announced, standing on a wooden crate so she could reach Eleanor's kitchen counter. "He says a person who can't cook for themselves is bound to go hungry on the frontier." Eleanor watched the girl work, noting the careful way she measured flour and the confident manner in which she handled the dough. Your papa seems to have taught you a great deal. He says a woman needs to know how to take care of herself, same as a man, Lily replied, rolling the dough with practiced strokes. He says someday I might want to have my own place, like you do, and I'll need to know how to make it work. It was a progressive sentiment for a man of the frontier, and it added another layer to Eleanor's growing understanding of Thomas Reed. Here was a man who saw strength in women, who was raising his daughter to be independent and capable rather than merely ornamental. What else does your papa say about women? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Lily's eyes sparkled with mischief. He says the right woman can make a house feel like home just by being in it. He says when he was married to Mama, even their little dugout felt like a palace because she was there. The girl paused in her rolling, her expression growing more serious. He says he never thought he'd find another woman who could make him feel that way, until he saw you. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. Lily? It's true, ma'am. He told me so himself when I asked him straight out why he keeps fixing things around your place when he thinks you're not looking. Lily resumed her rolling with renewed vigor. I told him he ought to just ask you proper if he could court you, but he says a man has to prove he's worthy before he starts making assumptions. And how does he plan to prove that? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. By showing you he can take care of what's yours, Lily said matter-of-factly. Papa says actions speak louder than words, and he wants you to know you can count on him. That afternoon, as Eleanor helped Lily gather eggs from the henhouse, she found herself seeing her property through new eyes. The stable door that opened smoothly, the fence that stood straight and strong, the water trough that had somehow acquired a new wooden cover to keep out debris, all of it evidence of a man who was courting her in the most practical way imaginable. Does your papa know you tell me these things? Eleanor asked as they walked back toward the house, their basket full of brown eggs. Lily considered this seriously. I reckon he suspects. Papa's not stupid, and I'm not very good at keeping secrets. She looked up at Eleanor with those earnest blue eyes. Are you angry that he's been fixing things without asking? Eleanor thought about it, surprised to realize that anger was the furthest thing from her mind. No, I'm not angry, but I am curious about why he doesn't just ask if I need help. Because he's scared you'll say no, Lily said simply. He says you're the strongest woman he's ever known, and he doesn't want you to think he believes you can't manage on your own. The insight was startling in its accuracy. Eleanor had spent so many years proving to herself and everyone else that she could handle whatever the frontier threw at her that she had forgotten what it might feel like to accept help freely given. Thomas Reed, it seemed, understood that her independence was precious to her, and he was finding ways to support her without threatening it. As the days passed and Lily's visits became a regular occurrence, Eleanor began to look forward to the stories the girl brought with her, tales of life in the cow camp, descriptions of the places the herd had been driven, and always, woven through it all, gentle revelations about Thomas Reed. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, the son of a school teacher who had taught him to read and write before consumption took her when he was 12. She learned that he had met Lily's mother at a church social in Colorado, and that they had been married for only 4 years before fever claimed her life. She learned that he read poetry by the campfire and could play the harmonica well enough to make the cattle settle for the night. Papa says music gentles the spirit, Lily explained one afternoon as she helped Eleanor mend a torn curtain. He says that's why he plays for the cattle, and why he used to sing to Mama when she was feeling poorly. Eleanor found herself imagining Thomas Reed by firelight, his weathered hands cradling a harmonica, his deep voice raised in song under the vast prairie sky. The image was surprisingly appealing, and she caught herself wondering what it would be like to sit beside such a fire, to be serenaded by such a man. Lily, she said carefully, does your papa ever? That is, has he said anything about wanting to call on me properly? The girl's face lit up. Oh, yes, ma'am. He talks about it all the time. He's been practicing what he wants to say, and he even asked Mr. Johnson, if he could borrow his good shirt for when he works up the courage. Lily leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I think he's planning to ask you soon. The herd's moving on next week, and he says he can't leave without settling things one way or another. The thought that Thomas Reed might be planning to move on, to disappear from her life as suddenly as he had entered it, sent an unexpected pang through Eleanor's chest. She had grown accustomed to the evidence of his presence, the small repairs, the thoughtful improvements, the knowledge that someone was watching over her welfare. More than that, she had grown accustomed to the warmth that Lily's stories brought to her solitary evenings. The way her house felt more alive when filled with tales of the man who had been observing her from afar with such quiet devotion. That evening, after Lily had ridden back to camp, Eleanor walked the perimeter of her property one more time. In the fading light, she could see all the ways Thomas Reed had touched her world. The straight fence lines, the sturdy gates, the small but significant improvements that spoke of a man who cared about her comfort and security. She found herself hoping that when he finally worked up the courage to call on her properly, she would have the wisdom to recognize the gift he was offering. Not just his heart, but his steady presence, his quiet strength, his understanding of what it meant to build something lasting in a land that could be both beautiful and unforgiving. As she stood there in the gathering dusk, Eleanor Hayes realized that somewhere in the space between Lily's first breathless announcement and this moment of quiet anticipation, she had begun to fall in love with a man she had barely met but had come to know through his actions, his daughter's stories, and the careful way he had been courting her without ever speaking a word of romance. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt since James died, and a hope she hadn't dared to nurture in longer than she could remember. The trouble began, as trouble often did in small frontier towns, with idle talk and too much whiskey. Eleanor first became aware of it on a Saturday morning in late October when she rode into Millbrook for supplies. The town was no more than a collection of wooden buildings scattered along a dusty main street, but it served the ranchers and cowboys within a day's ride. And Eleanor had been making the monthly journey for 3 years without incident. She noticed the change immediately in the way conversations seemed to pause when she entered Morrison's general store, the way eyes followed her movements as she selected flour and coffee beans. Mrs. Morrison, usually chatty and welcoming, seemed oddly formal as she tallied Eleanor's purchases. "That'll be $4.60, Mrs. Hayes," the storekeeper's wife said, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor placed the exact amount on the counter and waited for the usual pleasantries about the weather or inquiries about how she was managing the ranch. Instead, Mrs. Morrison busied herself with arranging items on the shelves, her movements sharp with barely concealed disapproval. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Morrison?" Eleanor asked finally. The older woman glanced around the store, noting the 2 other customers who were pretending not to listen. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, I suppose it's not my place to say, but, well, people are talking." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Talking about what?" "About you and that cowboy." "Mrs." Morrison said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "About how he's been seen coming and going from your place at all hours. About how his little girl practically lives there now." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the growing warmth between herself and Thomas, so pleased by Lily's companionship, that she had never considered how their innocent arrangement might appear to others. "Mrs. Morrison," Eleanor said carefully. "Mr. Reed has been kind enough to help with some repairs around the ranch. His daughter visits during the day, with my full knowledge and approval. There's nothing improper about any of it." "I'm sure that's true, dear Mrs." Morrison replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure at all. "But you know how people talk. A widow woman, living alone, and a single man. Well, it just doesn't look right, does it?" Eleanor left the store with her supplies and her cheeks burning with indignation. As she loaded her wagon, she became increasingly aware of the glances and whispered conversations that seemed to follow her down the street. By the time she reached the saloon, where she sometimes stopped to purchase the occasional bottle of medicinal whiskey her late husband had favored, she was prepared for more of the same treatment. What she wasn't prepared for was Roy Beckett. Beckett was a bull of a man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with small, mean eyes and hands that looked more comfortable wrapped around a bottle than honest work. He had a reputation for trouble, bar fights, unpaid debts, and a mouth that ran faster than his brain. Eleanor had managed to avoid him during her previous visits to town, but today he seemed determined to make her acquaintance. "Well, well," Beckett called out as Eleanor walked past the saloon's open doors. "If it isn't the Merry Widow herself, how's business, Mrs. Hayes?" Eleanor kept walking, but Beckett's voice followed her. "I hear you've been entertaining cowboys at your place. That's mighty neighborly of you." She turned then, her temper finally overriding her better judgment. "Mr. Beckett, if you have something to say to me, please have the courtesy to say it plainly." Beckett grinned, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. Several other men had gathered on the saloon's porch, drawn by the promise of entertainment. "Oh, I'm being plain enough. Just wondering how a respectable widow woman ends up with a reputation like yours." "And what reputation is that?" Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The kind that says you're mighty free with your favors," Beckett said, his grin widening. "The kind that says any cowpoke with a sad story and a pretty daughter can find himself a warm welcome at the Hayes place." The words hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt the eyes of the entire street upon her. She wanted to defend herself, to explain the innocent nature of her friendship with Thomas and Lily, but she knew that any protest would only feed the flames of gossip. "You're mistaken, Mr. Beckett," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "And you're being deliberately cruel." "Am I?" Beckett stepped down from the porch, moving closer. "Or am I just saying what everyone else is thinking? That maybe the Grieving Widow Act has gone on long enough, and now you're looking for some comfort?" Eleanor felt her face burn with shame and anger. She had done nothing wrong, nothing that any decent person could object to. Yet here she stood being publicly humiliated by a man whose own reputation was far from spotless. "That's enough." The voice came from behind Eleanor, deep and steady, and carrying an unmistakable note of authority. She turned to see Thomas Reed walking down the street toward them, his face set in lines she had never seen before. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger, his hand resting casually near the Colt revolver at his hip. "Reed," Beckett said, his grin faltering slightly. "We were just having a friendly conversation with Mrs. Hayes here." "Didn't sound friendly to me," Thomas replied. Stopping beside Eleanor, she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge, controlled but barely contained. "Sounded like you were bothering a lady who was trying to go about her business." "Bothering?" Beckett's courage seemed to return with his audience watching. "I was just commenting on how accommodating Mrs. Hayes has been to certain cowboys, sharing her hospitality so generously and all." Thomas took a step forward, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes that made her breath catch. This was not the gentle man who played harmonica for the cattle or braided his daughter's hair by firelight. This was someone altogether more dangerous. "Beckett," Thomas said quietly, "you're going to apologize to Mrs. Hayes right now." "Am I?" Beckett laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "And what if I don't feel like apologizing?" Thomas didn't answer with words. Instead, he simply stood there, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Beckett's face with the kind of unwavering attention a hawk might give a rabbit. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken threats and possibilities. Eleanor had heard stories about men like Thomas Reed, cowboys who had learned their trade in the violent years after the war, who could handle a gun as easily as a rope. Looking at him now, seeing the cold calculation in his blue eyes, she believed every one of those stories. Beckett evidently believed them too. His swagger faded, replaced by the wariness of a man who had suddenly realized he might be in over his head. "Look, Reed, I didn't mean anything by it," Beckett said, backing toward the saloon steps. "Just having some fun, that's all." "Apologize," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. Beckett glanced around at the watching crowd, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might refuse, might push the confrontation to its logical conclusion. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he muttered something that might have been an apology if one were feeling generous. "Louder," Thomas said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes," Beckett said more clearly, his voice tight with resentment. "I spoke out of turn." Thomas nodded once, but his posture remained tense, ready. "Mrs. Hayes is a respectable woman. Beckett, a widow trying to make an honest living on her own land. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. Are we clear?" "Clear as crystal," Beckett replied, then turned and pushed through the saloon doors with more haste than dignity. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, though Eleanor could see the way some of the onlookers glanced back at her and Thomas with expressions that ranged from approval to speculation. The damage, she realized, was already done. By defending her so publicly, Thomas had only confirmed in some minds that there was indeed something between them worth defending. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly as Thomas walked her back to her wagon. "Though I'm not sure your intervention helped my reputation any." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "I couldn't stand there and let him talk about you that way," he said finally. "No decent man could." "But now people will assume," Eleanor began. "Let them assume what they want," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't have you insulted by the likes of Roy Beckett, no matter what it costs." As Eleanor drove her wagon home that afternoon, she found herself thinking about the way Thomas had looked standing there in the street. Dangerous, protective, utterly uncompromising when it came to her honor. The thought should have worried her, should have made her question whether she was wise to allow such a man into her life. Instead, she found herself remembering the gentleness in his hands when he had lifted Lily into his arms, the careful way he had repaired her stable door, the poetry Lily said he read by the campfire. Here was a man with the capacity for both tenderness and violence, depending on what the situation required. The realization that Roy Beckett was not likely to forget this public humiliation came to her as she put her horses away for the night. Men like Beckett nursed grudges, and she had a feeling this confrontation was only the beginning of her troubles. But as she looked around her property, at the straight fence lines and sturdy gates, the evidence of Thomas Reed's quiet care, she found herself thinking that perhaps she was no longer facing those troubles alone. The first anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Eleanor's kitchen door sometime during the night. She found it when she came down to start the coffee. A folded piece of brown paper with her name scrawled across it in crude block letters. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, though she couldn't say whether from anger or apprehension. "Mrs. Hayes," the message read, the letters harsh and angular. "Decent folk don't want your kind in Millbrook. Send the cowboy away or face the consequences." Eleanor read it twice, then walked to the stove and fed the paper to the flames. She would not be intimidated by cowards who skulked in darkness, too craven to sign their threats. But as she went about her morning chores, she found herself glancing toward the horizon more often than usual, wondering if unfriendly eyes were watching her from the distant hills. The second letter came 3 days later, this one more explicit in its accusations and cruder in its language. Eleanor burned that one too, but not before noting that the handwriting appeared to be the same. Someone was making a concentrated effort to drive her away or force her to sever her connection with Thomas Reed. She said nothing to Lily about the letters when the girl arrived for her afternoon visit, though she found herself studying the child's face for signs that she had heard talk in the cow camp. If the men were discussing Eleanor's reputation around the fire, surely some of it would have reached young ears. "Papa's been mighty quiet lately," Lily observed as she helped Eleanor gather the last of the season's vegetables from the garden. "He sits and stares at the fire for hours, not even playing his harmonica." "Has he said why?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "He's worried about you," Lily said simply. "About what happened in town, about what folks are saying. He thinks maybe he's brought trouble to your doorstep by being friendly." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. Thomas's kindness, his quiet courtship, had indeed brought complications to her life, but she found she couldn't regret it. The warmth of his attention, the security of knowing someone cared about her welfare, was worth whatever gossip the small-minded citizens of Millbrook chose to spread. "What do you think, Lily?" Eleanor asked. "Do you think your papa has brought me trouble?" Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "I think some folks make their own trouble by not minding their own business," she said finally. "And I think Papa makes you smile more than you used to." The observation was startlingly accurate. Eleanor had not realized how much her demeanor had changed since Thomas and Lily had entered her life. But she supposed it was true. The long silences of her solitary evenings had been replaced by anticipation of Lily's visits, of discovering Thomas's latest quiet improvement to her property, of the possibility that he might finally work up the courage to call on her properly. That possibility seemed increasingly remote as the days passed. The cattle drive had moved on, taking the herd to winter pasture in the sheltered valleys to the south. But Thomas had remained in the area, taking temporary work with a local rancher. Lily reported that he was renting a small cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook, trying to establish himself as more than just a drifting cowhand. "He says he can't ask a woman to share his life if he doesn't have a life worth sharing," Lily explained one afternoon as she helped Eleanor preserve the last of the apples. "He's been talking to Mr. Peterson about maybe buying some land, starting his own small spread." The news filled Eleanor with a complicated mixture of hope and concern. The idea that Thomas was thinking seriously about settling down, about building a future stable enough to include a wife, was thrilling. But she also knew how difficult it was for a working cowboy to accumulate the capital necessary to purchase land, especially with winter coming and jobs becoming scarce. Her concerns proved prescient when Lily arrived the following week with troubling news. "Papa's been having trouble finding work," the girl reported, her usual cheerfulness dimmed with worry. "Mr. Peterson let him go last week, said he didn't need extra hands anymore, but Papa thinks it's because of the talk in town, because folks don't want to be associated with him." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest. It was one thing for busybodies to gossip about her personal life, quite another for that gossip to threaten Thomas's livelihood. What will he do? "He's thinking about moving on," Lily said quietly. "Maybe up to Montana, where nobody knows about any of this." The thought of Thomas leaving, of disappearing from her life as suddenly as he had entered it, sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. She had grown so accustomed to the evidence of his presence, the small repairs, the feeling of being watched over and cared for, that she couldn't imagine returning to her previous isolation. "Lily," she said carefully, "would you give your papa a message for me?" The girl's face brightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Tell him that if he's truly interested in calling on me, he shouldn't let a few small-minded people drive him away. Tell him that I would welcome his attention." It was as close to a declaration as Eleanor could bring herself to make, but she saw understanding dawn in Lily's eyes. The girl nodded solemnly, as if she had been entrusted with state secrets. "I'll tell him, ma'am, but Papa's awful proud. He might not want to bring more trouble to your door." Eleanor was still pondering this when she discovered the third letter, this one tucked into her mailbox rather than slipped under her door. The message was longer and more detailed than the previous two. describing in uncomfortable specificity what the writer believed was happening between her and Thomas. But it was the final paragraph that made her blood run cold. "If you don't send him away, we will make sure he goes. Accidents happen to cowboys who don't know their place." This letter she did not burn. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed it in her dresser drawer, understanding that she now possessed evidence of a specific threat. If anything happened to Thomas, at least there would be proof that it was not accidental. The proof came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, while Eleanor was in town buying winter supplies, Roy Beckett made his second serious mistake. This time, however, there were plenty of witnesses to see it unfold. According to the account Sheriff William Matthews gave her later, Beckett had been drinking since noon, working himself into a rage about the humiliation he had suffered at Thomas's hands. When Thomas entered the general store to purchase supplies for the small cabin he was renting, Beckett confronted him immediately. "Well, if it isn't the widow's pet cowboy," Beckett had announced loudly enough for the entire store to hear. "How's business? Reed, still making house calls?" Thomas, according to witnesses, had tried to ignore the provocation, continuing with his purchases while Beckett grew increasingly aggressive. It was only when Beckett made a crude reference to Eleanor's supposed moral character that Thomas finally responded. "Beckett," several witnesses reported hearing him say, "you've got about 10 seconds to take that back before I shut your mouth for you." What happened next was swift and decisive. Beckett, emboldened by whiskey and the presence of several cronies, made the mistake of reaching for the knife at his belt. Thomas disarmed him so quickly that most of the witnesses couldn't say exactly how it happened. One moment Beckett was drawing steel. The next, he was on his back with Thomas's boot on his chest and his own knife at his throat. "Sheriff Matthews," Thomas had said calmly, not moving from his position over the prostrate Beckett. "I believe this man just threatened me with a deadly weapon, in front of all these witnesses." Sheriff Matthews, a fair-minded man who had little use for Roy Beckett's brand of trouble, had arrested Beckett on the spot, but he had also taken Thomas aside afterward for what he described as a friendly conversation about keeping the peace. "Reed seems like a decent enough fellow," the sheriff told Eleanor when he rode out to inform her of the incident. "But Beckett's got friends, and they're not likely to let this slide. You might want to be extra careful for a while, ma'am." Eleanor thanked the sheriff for his concern, but privately she was thinking about the anonymous letters, about the escalating pattern of threats and confrontation. Roy Beckett was not the type of man to accept public humiliation gracefully, and he had already demonstrated his willingness to target her as a way of getting to Thomas. That evening, as she sat alone in her kitchen with the latest threatening letter spread on the table before her, Eleanor made a decision that would have shocked the woman she had been just a few months earlier. She loaded her late husband's rifle and placed it beside the front door, within easy reach but hidden from casual view. If Roy Beckett and his friends wanted to make trouble, she would be ready for them. But more than that, she found herself hoping that Thomas would not be discouraged by the day's events, would not see them as further evidence that his presence in her life brought nothing but complications. She had spent 3 years proving to herself and the world that she could manage alone. Now, faced with the possibility of losing the quiet, steady man who had been courting her with such patient devotion, she discovered that independence was a cold comfort compared to the warmth of genuine affection. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats, hoping against hope that Thomas would choose to stay and fight for what was growing between them rather than disappear into the vastness of the frontier, taking her heart with him. The first sign of trouble came with the smell of smoke. Eleanor woke in the deep hours of a December night to an acrid scent that had no place in the clean, cold air of winter. For a moment, she lay still in her bed, wondering if she had dreamed it. But the smell grew stronger, accompanied now by an orange glow that flickered against her bedroom window. She threw back her covers and rushed to look outside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hay barn, the large structure that held most of her winter feed for the livestock, was engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. The fire was already so advanced that she knew immediately it could not have started by accident. Eleanor pulled on her boots and coat over her nightgown and ran toward the barn, though she knew there was little hope of saving it. The structure was old and dry, and the flames had taken hold with the vicious enthusiasm of a fire fed by something more combustible than hay alone. As she drew closer, the smell of coal oil confirmed her suspicions. This blaze had been deliberately set. The horses in the nearby corral were screaming with terror, rearing and plunging against the fence rails in their panic. Eleanor's first thought was for their safety, but as she fumbled with the gate latch, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of town. Thomas Reed materialized out of the darkness like an answer to prayer, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim in the firelight. He leaped from the saddle before his mount had fully stopped and was at Eleanor's side in 3 long strides. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders as his eyes searched her face for signs of injury. "No, but the horses," Eleanor began. "I'll get them," Thomas said, already moving toward the corral. "You get whatever buckets you can find. We need to keep the fire from spreading to the house." They worked together with desperate efficiency, Eleanor forming a bucket brigade from the well while Thomas released the terrified horses and drove them to safety in the far pasture. The barn was beyond saving, but they managed to wet down the nearby structures enough to prevent the flames from spreading. It was only when the fire had burned itself down to smoldering ruins that they had time to catch their breath and survey the damage. The barn was a total loss, along with most of Eleanor's winter hay. Worse, scattered around the perimeter of the fire. Thomas found clear evidence that the blaze had been deliberately set. Empty coal oil containers and the remains of torches that had been used to ensure the flames took hold quickly. "Beckett," Thomas said grimly, holding up a charred piece of cloth that might have been part of a shirt. "This has his stink all over it." Eleanor sank onto an overturned bucket, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened. Without the hay, she would have to sell most of her livestock before spring. And without the livestock, the ranch would not generate enough income to sustain itself. In one night, Roy Beckett had struck a blow that might prove mortal to everything she had worked to build. "Why?" she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. "Why would he do this to me? I never did anything to hurt him." Thomas knelt beside her, his face hard with anger but his voice gentle. "Because he couldn't hurt me any other way. Because he knew that destroying what's yours would be the surest way to drive me off." The truth of it hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This attack had been aimed at Thomas as much as at her, an attempt to prove that his presence in her life brought nothing but destruction. She looked around at the smoking ruins of her barn, at the scattered debris and the frightened animals, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "Well," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "he's made a serious mistake if he thinks this will make me send you away." Thomas stared at her, something flickering in his eyes that might have been surprise or hope or both. "Eleanor, I should have burned those letters," she said, standing up with sudden resolution. "I should have taken them to Sheriff Matthews weeks ago instead of trying to handle this alone." "What letters?" Thomas demanded. Eleanor told him about the anonymous threats, watching his face grow darker with each detail. When she mentioned the specific threat against his life, his jaw tightened until she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I could have—" "What, left town? Abandoned me to deal with this alone?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, Thomas, I won't be driven away by bullies. And I won't let you be driven away either," as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of approaching horses broke the silence of the night. Eleanor tensed, wondering if Beckett and his cronies had returned to survey their handiwork, but Thomas laid a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's all right," he said. "That's Sheriff Matthews." Indeed, the sheriff appeared out of the darkness accompanied by 2 deputized townsmen, their faces grim in the dying firelight. Matthews dismounted and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of deliberate destruction. "Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Reed," he said by way of greeting. "I saw the glow from town and figured there might be trouble out here."
"There's been trouble. All right,"
Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the anger that burned in her chest.
"Someone set fire to my barn. Deliberately."
Sheriff Matthews walked the perimeter of the ruined structure, occasionally stopping to examine pieces of evidence that Thomas pointed out. When he returned to where Eleanor waited, his expression was troubled but determined. "I'm afraid you're right, ma'am. This was arson, plain and simple." He glanced at Thomas. "I don't suppose you have any idea who might have done such a thing?" "Roy Beckett," Thomas said without hesitation. "He's been making threats for weeks, ever since that business in town." "Can you prove that?" Matthews asked. Thomas was about to respond when one of the deputies called out from near the house, "Sheriff, you'd better come look at this." They followed the deputy to Eleanor's front porch, where he had discovered something that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Pinned to her door with a large knife was a piece of paper with a message scrawled in the same crude handwriting she had come to know all too well. "Last warning," it read. "Next time it will be the house with you in it." Sheriff Matthews carefully removed the knife and paper, handling them as evidence. "Well," he said grimly, "that's as clear a threat as I've ever seen, and stupid enough to be Beckett's work." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked. "First, I'm going to ride out to Beckett's place and have a conversation with him. If I find evidence that he was involved in this, and I suspect I will, he's going to jail." Matthews folded the threatening note carefully. "But Mrs. Hayes, I have to be honest with you. Even if we arrest Beckett, he's got friends who might not let the matter drop." "Then what do you suggest?" Eleanor asked. Matthews glanced at Thomas, then back at Eleanor. "I suggest you not spend any more nights alone out here until we sort this out. Is there somewhere you could stay? Family in town, perhaps?" Eleanor shook her head. She had no family left in Wyoming, and the idea of abandoning her ranch felt like surrender. "She could stay at my cabin," Thomas said quietly. "It's small, but it's closer to town, and I could keep watch." The suggestion hung in the air between them, fraught with implications that went far beyond simple safety. For Eleanor to stay at Thomas's cabin, even under these circumstances, would provide ammunition for every gossip in Millbrook. Her reputation, already damaged by association with him, would be utterly destroyed. But as she looked around at the smoking ruins of her barn, at the evidence of Roy Beckett's malicious destruction, Eleanor found that she no longer cared what the gossips might say. Let them talk. She had more important things to worry about than the opinions of people who had never shown her an ounce of genuine kindness. "All right," she said, meeting Thomas's eyes, "but only until Sheriff Matthews can arrest Beckett and put an end to this." What none of them could have predicted was that Roy Beckett, drunk on his success and emboldened by what he saw as Eleanor's capitulation, would make one final, fatal mistake that very night. As Sheriff Matthews and his deputies rode toward town to organize a search party, and as Thomas helped Eleanor gather a few essential belongings from her house, Beckett was bragging to his cronies in the saloon about the fire he had set. He was describing in loud, drunken detail how he had soaked the barn with coal oil and watched it burn, how he planned to drive the uppity widow out of the territory once and for all. What Beckett didn't know was that one of his drinking companions, a ranch hand named Jake Morrison, was the nephew of the store owner who had witnessed Beckett's earlier confrontation with Thomas. Morrison had no love for Beckett, and even less tolerance for men who made war on women. While Beckett continued his boastful confession, Morrison slipped out of the saloon and went looking for Sheriff Matthews. By dawn, Roy Beckett was in jail, charged with arson and terroristic threatening. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the physical proof from the fire scene, but his own drunken confession witnessed by a dozen men. More importantly, faced with the prospect of a long prison sentence. Beckett had broken down and signed a full confession, implicating 2 other men who had helped him plan and execute the attack. Eleanor learned of Beckett's arrest when Sheriff Matthews rode out to Thomas's cabin the next morning. The news should have filled her with relief, but as she stood on the cabin's small porch, watching the sheriff ride away, she found herself thinking about what came next. The immediate threat was over, but the damage was done. Her barn was destroyed, her winter feed was gone, and her reputation in Millbrook was in tatters. More than that, she had spent the night under Thomas Reed's roof, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But as Thomas appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that warmed her more than the morning sun, Eleanor realized that perhaps some lines were meant to be crossed, perhaps some risks were worth taking, regardless of what the world might say. The weeks following Roy Beckett's arrest passed in a strange kind of suspended quiet, as if the entire territory was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Eleanor returned to her ranch the day after Beckett's confession, but the burned shell of her barn served as a constant reminder of how quickly a life could be upended by malice and small-mindedness. Thomas had insisted on helping her assess the damage and plan for rebuilding, though he was careful to observe the proprieties now that the immediate danger had passed. He arrived each morning at a respectable hour and left before sunset, always with Lily as a chaperone. The 3 of them worked together to clear the debris and begin the slow process of restoration. But Eleanor could sense an underlying tension in Thomas that hadn't been there before. It took her nearly a month to understand the source of his unease. The trial had made headlines in the territorial newspapers, painting Eleanor as the innocent victim of a vindictive man's campaign of terror. But buried in the more sensational coverage was a detail that had apparently eaten away at Thomas's peace of mind: the revelation that Eleanor's ordeal had begun because of her association with him. "If I'd never come into your life, none of this would have happened," he said quietly one afternoon as they worked to frame the foundation for a new barn. "Your reputation would still be intact, your property would be whole, and you'd be living in peace." Eleanor set down her hammer and turned to face him fully. "Thomas Reed, if you think I regret meeting you, then you don't know me as well as I thought you did." "But look what it's cost you," he insisted, gesturing toward the blackened ground where her barn had stood. "Look what people are saying about you in town." "What people say in town has never put food on my table or kept me warm at night," Eleanor replied sharply. "And I'll not have you taking responsibility for Roy Beckett's actions. That man made his own choices, just as I've made mine." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands working the wood with the same steady precision he brought to everything he did. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She felt her heart begin to beat faster, sensing that this conversation had been building for weeks. "All right. If I were to leave, if I were to take Lily and move on to Montana or Colorado, would that make your life easier?" The question hit her like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily breathless. She had been so focused on rebuilding, on moving forward from the crisis, that she hadn't allowed herself to consider the possibility that Thomas might still be thinking of leaving. "Is that what you want to do?" she asked carefully. "What I want and what's best for you might be 2 different things," Thomas replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about whether I have the right to ask you to share the kind of life I can offer." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of life is that?" Thomas set down his tools and turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "The life of a man who owns little more than a horse and a saddle, who's never had a permanent home, who can't offer a woman the security she deserves." He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to speak. "The life of a man whose very presence seems to bring trouble to the people he cares about." "Thomas." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the fire, about what kind of man courts a woman like you, a woman with her own land, her own house, her own place in the world, and I keep coming back to the same answer: a better man than I am." The pain in his voice was so evident that Eleanor wanted to reach out and touch his face, to smooth away the lines of doubt and self-recrimination that had appeared there. Instead, she kept her hands at her sides and chose her words carefully.
And what if the woman in question has her own ideas about what kind of man she wants?
She asked quietly. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw hope flicker in his blue eyes before caution reasserted itself. What do you mean? Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would change everything between them, one way or another. I mean that maybe she's tired of being protected and provided for. Maybe she's spent 3 years learning to take care of herself and doesn't need a man who can offer her security so much as one who can offer her partnership. Partnership? Thomas repeated the word as if it were foreign to him.
Yes.
Eleanor felt her courage building with each word.
Maybe she wants a man who sees her as an equal,
who values her strength instead of trying to shield her from every hardship.
Maybe she wants someone who will work beside her to build something together,
instead of someone who thinks his job is to take care of her like she's made of china. Thomas was very still, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. And if such a man existed, he said slowly, what would she expect from him?
Honesty,
Eleanor said without hesitation.
Loyalty,
the willingness to stay and fight for what they're building together instead of running at the first sign of trouble. She paused, then added more quietly,
and maybe, if she's very lucky, love.
The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Thomas took a step closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of leather and horses and honest sweat that clung to his clothes. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you hanging laundry on your line, fighting with a sheet that was trying to blow away in the wind. You stood there wrestling with that stubborn piece of cloth like it was a wild Mustang, and when you finally got it pinned down, you smiled like you'd just conquered the world. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from joy or relief or simple gratitude that he had finally spoken the words, she couldn't say.
Why didn't you tell me?
Because I was afraid, Thomas admitted. Afraid you'd think I was just another drifter looking for a soft place to land. Afraid you'd see me as someone trying to take advantage of a woman alone. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against hers. Afraid you'd say no.
And now?
Eleanor asked, allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. Now I'm more afraid of losing you by staying silent than by speaking up. Thomas lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Eleanor Hayes, I know I don't have much to offer you besides a willing pair of hands and a heart that's yours whether you want it or not. But if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that sometimes the best partnerships are built on love instead of ledger books. Eleanor felt her heart swell with a happiness so pure it was almost painful.
Thomas Reed,
she said, stepping closer until there was barely an inch of space between them.
Are you asking me to marry you?
Yes, ma'am, he said solemnly. Though I should warn you that I come with a 7-year-old daughter who has very strong opinions about most everything. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and clear in the crisp winter air.
I think I can handle Lily. The question is, can you handle a wife who's used to making her own decisions and doesn't intend to stop now?
I'm counting on it, Thomas said. And then he was kissing her, soft and sweet and full of promise. They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, and they broke apart to see Lily riding toward them on her spotted pony, her face bright with excitement.
Papa, Mrs. Hayes,
she called out as she slid from her mount.
Guess what?
Mister, Johnson says the cattle buyers from Denver are coming through next week, and they're looking for... She stopped abruptly, taking in their joined hands and the unmistakable glow of happiness on both their faces.
Oh,
she said, her eyes widening.
Oh, my.
Lily, Thomas said, his voice gentle but serious.
How would you feel about Mrs. Hayes becoming your new mama?
Lily looked from her father to Eleanor and back again, her expression thoughtful. Then a grin spread across her face that was bright enough to light up the whole territory.
I think, she said solemnly, that it's about time you two figured that out.
As winter gave way to spring, and they worked together to build not just a new barn, but a new life. Eleanor often thought about the little girl who had come running across the prairie with news of her father's hidden feelings.
Sometimes, she reflected, it took the honest heart of a child to push the adult world in the direction it needed to go.
The people of Millbrook could whisper all they wanted about the widow who had married the cowboy. Eleanor Hayes Reed was too busy planting her garden and planning her future to care what they said. She had found something worth more than reputation or security. She had found a love built on respect and partnership, sealed with the blessing of a little girl who had always known exactly what her papa needed. And if that love had been born from a child's breathless announcement that, "Papa's afraid to tell you he loves you," well, Eleanor thought that was the most beautiful beginning to any love story she had ever heard.